Hello and welcome. India clearly has a jobs problem, particularly a quality of jobs problem and a quality of good income problem. So let's try and understand that a little better, as thematically as well as with our guest who we are going to join very shortly. But before that, let's look at some numbers in a broad sense, beginning with today. So our current unemployment as per CMI data stands at about 8.1%. Now that's better than the 12% or close to 12% we hit at the peak of the second wave of COVID-19. But on the other hand, only 40% of Indians are employed or looking for work compared to about 60% in other countries. Now let's look at some more figures. An interesting insight is that about 26% of all Indian males between 20 and 30 with at least 10 years of education were not working. But on the other hand, above 30 in terms of age was about 2%. Let's look at another data. There are millions of jobs in India's informal services and contract labor sector, but under 5% of our workforce is formally skilled, and contrast that with about 75% in Germany and 96% in South Korea. Now these are of course small countries, but it's something to definitely be concerned about. Now let's look at another figure. India is now facing one of the lowest female participation rates in the workforce. This number amazingly has been declining. It was about 35% in 2005 and is now about 21%. The world average is about 50%. Also, and quite dramatically so, many of the jobs that we saw come back after COVID-19 and as the economies recovered, only saw those jobs going back to males, but whereas females continued to lose out. So many of the females who dropped out during the COVID period didn't come back, though the males did. So what is the way forward? A book that has just emerged is called The Struggle and the Promise: Restoring India's Potential by Naushad Forbes, addresses some of these issues and also talks about some of the solutions. So a quick introduction: Dr. Naushad Forbes is co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. Naushad Forbes received his bachelor's, master's and PhD degrees from Stanford, where he also taught an occasional course for 20 years. He has written widely on innovation in developing countries and higher education in India, and he's on the board of several education institutions and public companies, and of course is the author of this new book. Dr. Forbes, thank you very much for joining me and welcome. So I'm sorry I've used a lot of data points to kick our conversation off, because we are going to talk about jobs, and many of these data points are, except for the first one that I quoted from CMI, are from your book, either which you've sourced or actually quoted the Nobel Prize winning economist Abhijit Banerjee. So first question, in the context of jobs, what is the struggle and what is the potential?
So the struggle is exactly, I think, what you outlined, Govind, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I think this topic of jobs is, I think it's our biggest public policy question. It's our biggest challenge as a country, and it's also our biggest opportunity. So that's really it's the title is perfect, and it applies perfectly to this topic that I think you very correctly focused on. The struggle is the data points that you mentioned. We have very low labor force participation in the country. The 40% number that you mentioned is low by international standards. We have, among the top 20 economies in the world, again, the number that you mentioned, the lowest female labor force participation ratio. We have a much lower female labor force participation ratio now than our neighbors in Bangladesh, for example. We have even a lower labor force participation ratio than Saudi Arabia, which is not a country that you would want to compare for female employment and female employment prospects. So, and then third, not a number that you mentioned, if you look at our labor market overall, the great bulk of the jobs that we have are informal jobs in the informal sector. We spend a lot of time in policy circles focusing on the formal jobs and policies needed, labor rights, etc., for formal jobs. But those formal jobs account for well under 15% of the total employment in the country. Over 85% is informal jobs. Jobs, for example, yes, it includes agriculture, but much beyond agriculture. The big sectors are things like retail, And yes, some of it is organized, but the great bulk of it is informally organized. It's small owner-managed shops where there are 2 or 3 people who work in that shop assisting the owner. It's someone on the side of the road who makes tea. It's a fruit vendor with a hand cart. These are it's a security guard. These are the very large numbers of jobs that we actually have in the country, literally by the hundreds of million. So that, if you like, is where the struggle comes from. The fact that we have low labor force participation, particularly low female labor force participation,
right,
and highly skewed labor market where the bulk of the labor market is focused on informal jobs. Now, where's the opportunity? Where's the promise? If you look around the world through time, through history, economic history says that the biggest single driver of growth and prosperity for a country as it develops is the movement of people from lower productivity occupations into higher productivity occupations. We have this opportunity still before us. We have 120 million people employed in agriculture. We don't need 120 million people employed in agriculture. And when, for example, we saw a lot of reverse migration taking place during the early days of the first wave of the pandemic, when migrant labor moved back to their villages, they moved back because they had no other choice. They moved back not because suddenly there were opportunities in their villages. They moved back because at least they had a family there that would support them when they were left with nothing, and they lost those informal jobs in cities. So they moved back to villages. But by moving back to villages, they actually subtracted from our overall GDP growth because they would earn less. And that would actually show as a minus. And my estimate is that the 10 million reverse migration subtracted about 0.5% from our GDP, simply as a result of that reverse migration that took place. And that 10 million has still not returned to the cities. We've seen an increase in agricultural employment in these last 2 years, which is remarkable, unheard of, and not a good thing for a country like us. Because for a country like us, we have overemployment in relatively low productivity agriculture. You're adding to that overemployment because people have no other choice. So all that is part of struggle. Promise is, listen, all of this is opportunity too, because the moment those 10 million people actually come back to cities, you'll get a pickup in GDP growth. You'll get people will become more affluent. As they become more affluent, right, they spend more money, and you have these multiplier benefits that starts getting the economy motoring in an effective way again. Right. So I think the promise is this: if we can put millions of people to more productive work in good quality jobs, we have the potential to create an economic miracle that will sustain for 30 years. And it will sustain all of Indian industry and all of the world's industry. So I think it's really in everyone's interest.
Right. And let's look at the nature of jobs. You've pointed out, for example, in your book, that the problem is not that we are not creating jobs. The problem is that, and if that was the case, we would have seen incessant social strife, to quote your words. And obviously, as you pointed out, the problem is that there are millions and millions of people in informal and contract jobs. Now, if this is not a problem for the people who are in it, maybe they don't have a choice, then for who is this a problem?
Well, it's a relative point. So for all of these individuals, they love the fact that they've got these jobs. So instead of, we may have in our heads, especially when we live in cities, we have this we have a view of rural life that is somewhat glorified, I think. If it was as good as it actually is, why would so many millions want to move to cities and live in slums very often, just so that they can access jobs, better quality jobs? Those better quality jobs are these informal jobs, but they're a lot better than the jobs they're leaving behind. They're a lot better than being an extra pair of hands on a field that already has enough hands actually growing crops on that field. So I think it's relative to that. This is an attractive job, and the people working as delivery boys or selling tea on the side of the road or whatever, like the jobs that they have. They're relative to what they otherwise had, they're attractive. Relative to what we need as a country for the long run, they have limits. And they have limits because take a job as a security guard. How do you grow productivity in the job that a security guard plays? It's very difficult to think about how you grow productivity there. In manufacturing, we know how to grow productivity. That's what we've done for centuries. We know how to manage the process such that you grow productivity year on year on year. And if you grow productivity year on year on year, you can grow wages year on year on year. So those are what I would call good quality jobs where by skilling, by improving the capabilities of people, you can grow productivity in the long run. And some of these informal jobs, you struggle with that productivity dynamic.
Right. And could you explain to us what does productivity mean thematically as well as empirically in the context of India?
Output per person. And how do you measure output? Typically, you measure output in value terms. You measure, it's very nice to be able to measure it in unit terms, but you want to add one unit to the other, and it's difficult to add, let's say, the output of, say, a service occupation, the output of barbers. You can count haircuts, but how do you add haircuts to, let's say, haircuts to textiles that you produce in a textile factory? You can't add those, so you add them in terms of value. And then you say value of output per person is the typical productivity metric. When you really want to go in a little more, I think, sensitively, you then say value added per person. So you say, what's the total value of output minus the total value of input? So that's your value added. And you divide that value added number by the number of people, and that tells you how productive one is actually being. And for most practical purposes, that metric of value added per person is a pretty powerful productivity metric. At the level of a country, value added per person is nothing other than GDP per capita. That says how rich the country actually is.
Right. And when you look at a large country like India, how does a country like India, I mean, as we talk about solutions, how does a country like India with a large workforce and a population move towards greater productivity without conceptually putting some people or lots of people out of jobs?
So the way in which it's happened over time and can happen for us as well, the way it's happened in India as well, but not enough, is by moving people from low productivity occupations to high productivity occupations. The classic move is someone who works in agriculture moving into manufacturing. So you get two benefits. You get the benefit that you're moving from a lower productivity occupation to a higher productivity occupation. By the way, the typical jump is like a factor of 30. Yeah. So your 30 times your value addition is something like 30 times what it is in agriculture when you move into manufacturing, modern manufacturing. And these are 30 times is in India. Yeah. So you move into manufacturing, you get that big benefit, this big jump in productivity. The second thing is the point that I made earlier, that you can grow productivity in manufacturing more easily. We know how to do that. You can grow it over time. So you not only get the benefit of that big initial jump as you move to the new occupation, but you can then keep growing productivity year on year on year for decades, actually. And that is a nice dynamo to have that powers the economy and takes it forward.
Right. And you've argued, for example, that we need lots more manufacturing jobs if we are to raise the percentage contribution of manufacturing to overall India's gross domestic product. Now, again, it seems that we hit, one is maybe the perils of the passage of time, because in the time that we've been chasing a manufacturing target, it's also moved out of the country. Other countries have moved in. Now, how do we even chase, let's say, scale targets in manufacturing? And that's the first question. And the second is manufacturing the only way out if we are to create higher paying, better quality jobs for India's millions?
So I'll start with a quick answer to the second question first, which is manufacturing is not the only answer. And we'll come back to the other services answers later on. But how do you create millions of good quality manufacturing jobs? We as you pointed out, manufacturing as a share of GDP has been around 15% for the last 30 years. We've had a goal in the current government, we've had a goal in the previous government of raising that share from 15 to 25%. It stayed at 15%, more or less. It goes up by 1% or 2, it comes down by 1% or 2. It's around 15%. How do you create that? How do you create that growth in employment? For various reasons, we have more skill and capital intensive manufacturing in the country than most countries at our level of per capita GDP, our level of wealth. We have a per capita GDP that is quite similar, for example, to Vietnam. That is quite similar today to Bangladesh. But Bangladesh, Vietnam have for them, manufacturing is a higher share of GDP than it is for us, quite a bit higher. And manufacturing employment has a much higher share in total employment than it is for us. And the reason is they have tended to specialize in labor intensive manufacturing. Things like garments, footwear, food processing. These are these labor intensive sectors which have really been the source of industrialization and economic growth for countries ever since Britain was the first industrial, went through its first industrial revolution in 250 years ago. It started with actually textiles and garments and moved from there. And it's been true for every country that has industrialized since. That's something that we have tended to wrestle with for various historical reasons. We chose more capital intensive industry. We chose to invest in steel plants and capital goods and so on. And we tended to neglect those consumer goods that are much more labor intensive. We almost sneer at the consumer good manufacturing, that sort of low tech stuff. But that low tech stuff puts millions of people to work. And it's very highly productive for us as a country if we can employ people by the million in making garments and footwear and rubber products and processing food, and then exporting those products around the world. It's an opportunity that still exists for us.
Right, and the regulations that govern, let's say, size of firms which can manufacture garments or footwear are no longer as restrictive or no longer there in the form that they were earlier. So what stops us, or what stops private enterprise from doing exactly what, let's say, Bangladesh is doing? And there's an interesting anecdote that you've quoted where you say that a garment manufacturer in India may have 3,000 to 5,000 employees. In Bangladesh, it's more than 30,000 employees. So that also demonstrates the difference in scale.
Yeah, exactly. The Indian manufacturers tend to see large numbers of labor as a problem, as something to be avoided. It's a legacy of decades of policy that, in a sense, supported formally employed labor at the expense of capital. And I sympathize with the objective. The motive was right. The motive was, how do you provide people who don't have that much with more in the way of rights, etc. I sympathize with that. But the net effect was that it tended to discourage the creation of high employment sectors like garments. And we might, with, I think, justification again, we might look at Bangladesh's garment industry and say, what terrible working conditions, etc. The solution is not to bring in the kinds of laws that then disincentivize the creation of high labor intensive sectors. The solution is to raise the rights of people in those sectors to try and pressurize firms to improve working conditions, which, by the way, is exactly what's been happening in Bangladesh. And you see, 10 years ago, working conditions in the garment industry in Bangladesh were much worse than they are today. Today, they've improved very significantly, even though the labor laws have not changed that much. What's driven that is buyers in international markets have been pressurizing their suppliers in Bangladesh to improve their working conditions for people, with very good reason. They were terrible earlier on. They've improved over this last 10 years. And people today, given the choice, have the choice of moving into those jobs and getting a job that's a better job than someone who would, you take the worst garment company today, it's still a more attractive job than, let's say, someone who has to work as a security guard, for a lower wage, which doesn't rise year on year, in working conditions that are not particularly attractive. They're not any better than the working conditions of the person working in the garment factory. So I think, we have this legacy that still continues now, that even though the laws are being improved, even though there has been significant progress in reforming our labor regulations, the legacy, though, is that Indian industrialists have the sense that employing a lot of labor is a bad idea. So it took decades for that belief to get built up. It will take a long time for it to go away. So I think we have to sustain for many years improved labor laws, and then we'll need a few examples of success of people who make a lot of money by going into labor-intensive manufacturing. We need a few success stories. Someone who will set up a 50,000-person garment factory and do really well and build a really great name for themselves. We need a few of those examples that will then inspire many others to do the same thing. Right. I wanted to come back to your second question, which is that is manufacturing enough, or is there nothing more to that story? And very much there is a lot else that we can do in the service sector. And you may have seen that around a month back, Raghuram Rajan wrote an article talking about, that look, India may have missed the manufacturing export opportunity, but there's a services export opportunity that we can still tap. He's right, and I have a concern. He's right in that there is a lot of opportunity in many parts of services. So, for example, is there an opportunity in tourism? There's huge opportunity in tourism. I talk about that in the book some. And there's huge opportunity to provide good quality jobs in tourism, jobs where productivity growth is possible, jobs where people learn how to operate in a modern environment. They have all manner of benefits, and we have a huge opportunity in tourism without question. We could, we attract the number of tourists that we attract, foreign tourists that we attract every year is very small for a country of our size, and certainly very small for a country with what we have to offer in terms of tourist attractiveness. So, we attract less than half the number of tourists. I think 1/3 the number of tourists that Thailand does. 1/5 the number of tourists, less than 1/6, 1/7 the number of tourists that France does. There's no good reason why. We can attract many more tourists. We can put many more millions to work in good quality jobs related to the tourism industry. So that's a services opportunity. It's export of a different kind. You're exporting your services in a sense by having foreign tourists come and spend their money in the country. That's a great way of actually exporting more. And I agree entirely with Raghuram Rajan that those kinds of opportunities should be tapped in full, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about how. But those should be tapped in full.
Right. Yeah, and the figures you quote are quite interesting. So you've said that India gets about 15 million tourists.
Yes.
This is obviously the pre-COVID high, I'm assuming.
Yes.
France is about 83 million and Thailand is about 33 million. So there we are. But interestingly, about half of those 15 million, according to you, are non-resident
NRIs.
Indians or visiting
NRIs who come back, at Christmas time, etc., to visit their families, which is great. But they're not sort of foreign tourists who come to India. Mind you, I mean, they are good tourists, because very often when they come and visit their families, they travel around a bit and they operate as tourists. So I'm not quibbling with, I don't see NRIs as not a high quality tourist. I just think that
we need more
it says that there's a much bigger opportunity out there if we can attract foreign tourists by the tens of millions.
Right. Okay. So we're going to come back to the demand side of this problem in a moment, but let's talk about the supply side. One of the things that you've talked about is skilling, and the role of government in doing so, and how should, let's say, the workforce gear itself up for better opportunities, and indeed, who should be driving this? Should it be the federal government? Should it be the state government? Should it be private sector alone? Walk us through your thoughts there.
So, if you look at, I mean, you use some of the numbers, Govind, which I thought were quite striking when I first saw them, on what proportion of our total workforce is formally skilled. And we have a very small, very tiny proportion that's formally skilled, 4% or whatever. We set ourselves a very good goal when we set up the National Skills Development Corporation, now I guess around almost 15 years ago, I think, maybe 13 years ago. And when we set it up, the original objective was, in the long run, skill 500 million people. At some point in time, that 500 million became, let's skill, I think it was 200 million people. At some point, it reduced further, and it finally came down to 10 million. So we've kind of scaled back our ambition in terms of formally skilling the population, and that's a mistake. Now, who should we skill, and what skills should we provide? The skills that we know how to provide, again, are where there are few jobs. It's manufacturing. The skills that we need to skill people in and provide are all these informal occupations. Start with, which is the single profession, if you like, where we've created the largest number of jobs: construction. So let's really focus a lot of our skilling activity around construction, because we've created more jobs in construction in these last 30 years than in any other sector. So how do we really focus our skilling activities on construction? And the opportunity is huge. You just have to look around in, any of our smaller, well, not just smaller towns, larger towns too, and you'll see really horrible construction taking place, really ugly construction. All over the town, sometimes in really beautiful landscapes. So fairly, we can skill people so that we can improve the quality of what gets constructed, improve the way it looks, make it a much pleasanter place to visit, and also a place to live in or work in. There are big opportunities in construction. Take other service occupations. Take travel and tourism again. In travel and tourism, if we want this to be a huge opportunity for us, as we should, let's focus our skilling on travel and tourism. Again, we know how to skill people in machining, in assembly operations, etc. Let's learn how to skill people in these softer areas of dealing with customers, tour guides, whatever, where we potentially can create millions and millions of good quality jobs.
Right. So skilling is one input on the supply side. Are you seeing any other inputs where, let's say, again, government has an intervention or a role to play, or is it left to really the individual to fend for herself or himself? So,
I want to speak about industry and its role, because I think there's a major part that industry can play there. So I think there is the National Skills Development Corporation, when it was set up as an independent body that would be where the government would own a share, industry associations would own a share, and it would be run in an independent, professional way. It started off that way. I think somewhere along the way it's wobbled some. I think it needs to go back to its original objective of being professionally run and operated as an independent corporation with a lot of industry input and oversight. All the skills councils tend to be chaired by people from industry. So that's something we got right in a very effective way. The skills themselves need to be broadened to services in a much more focused way, as we spoke earlier on. I think on the policy side, the other big objective has to be primary education and secondary education. We need to focus, the new education policy has the right objective for schools. It says focus on second standard outcomes as one of the key objectives of school education. Because if we don't get second standard, we don't get basically every student up to the second standard level where they can read and do basic arithmetic, later education is not something they benefit from because they're still struggling to get those basic skills in place so that they can acquire the somewhat more advanced education. It's a very good outcome. We should be putting a lot of resource into just that outcome. And we should, when I say we, I mean both government, I mean union government. So the union government should be incentivizing, because state subject, incentivizing state governments to do the right thing here. State government should see this, and we should be monitoring state government performance on improving school outcomes. We have an annual status of education report that is done by Pratham, the NGO Pratham. We should use that output to actually grade state governments on how effectively they're running a good second standard outcome program, so that those basic skills are being learned by children when they should actually have them. And third, by industry. Industry already spends most of its, I think about 35% of its CSR funding goes into education. It's the single largest item. I'm very glad it is. But we need to focus that CSR spending on these same primary education outcomes. So if we can focus them again, I have some numbers in the book where I say that, look, my estimate is that CI, Confederation of Indian Industry members alone, work with around 30,000 schools in the country as a part of our CSR work. And if we simply focused on that single outcome of second standard outcomes, second standard skills that are learned by children, we could improve skills for around 1.5 million children a year. That's not a small number. That's like 15% of all the children going through the school system. It could have potentially very transformative impact over the years.
Right. Okay. So let me come back to the demand side. As we talk about job creation, and I think we've understood to some extent now what are the dynamics at play. A question could be, who should be really driving these jobs and job creation? Should it be entrepreneurs? Should we be thinking about entrepreneurship in maybe the modern context that we know it as a panacea of sorts? Is it large firms, small firms? Because what you've said earlier also is that the natural tendency is for people to move or gravitate towards small organizations, very small enterprises, almost informal conditions. So what's the structure that you see here as we look ahead?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think you asked the question exactly right, Go, and I fully agree with you asked the question not in terms of how should government be creating jobs, because at the end of the day, we sometimes frame it that way, and I think it's the wrong way of framing the question, because the government can enable job creation. It can't, by and large, beyond a small limit, create jobs itself. It can create jobs by, let's say, awarding large infrastructure projects, which create construction jobs and so on. But that's it. Beyond that, it can only enable wider job creation in the economy. The government role should be pick those sectors, ensure that those sectors where jobs which are employment intensive, what we've been talking about, employment intensive sectors like garments and food processing and so on, that those sectors can thrive through the right kind of policy, wider policy environment. ensure that labor laws support the creation and the employment of people by the thousand. And then after that, leave it to companies to get on with creating those jobs. Then it's for industry to actually create those jobs. And I think all industry, we're such a large country and such a diverse country. We need to create many more jobs in large industry, including large service industries, and we need to create many more jobs in small industries, both in services and in manufacturing. We need it all. So, at the end of the day, it's how vibrant the overall economy is. That's what will determine whether or not we create the millions of jobs that we need.
Right. My last set of questions, you've talked, we may not get into it today, but in your book, you've talked a lot about protection, the role of free trade, historically and today, and how that could contribute to a fast growth economy and of course creation of jobs. You've also talked about R&D spending, you've talked about the role of design, all of which is very critical in the way manufacturing evolves in a country. Let me bring you to something that we are seeing around the world today. And it goes back to the protection point that you made strongly in your book. We are clearly seeing a big shift in geopolitics, and not just the India-China equation, but also the Russia angle, and the fact that this is directly affecting not just oil prices, but also causing firms to relook at supply chains and really thinking about a world where you're far more self-sufficient. Now, India, as you've pointed out also in your book, has seen tariffs go up for the first time in decades. We are talking about productivity linked incentives, which in your, I think the way you argue it is has no clear sunset and not really export oriented, and therefore maybe not the best thing to do. But given this larger world that we are now in already and heading towards, where does this all stack up?
So you're quite right. I mean, the world has been moving in a more protectionist direction. That doesn't necessarily make it good to do for us, and I argue that it actually doesn't. That actually, if we were less protectionist, if we reduce tariffs, we've increased tariffs on over 3,000 items, over half of our imports in these last 5 years. If we were actually to reduce tariffs, and we can reduce tariffs in a very scheduled, clear, transparent way, saying that, listen, if we're at 20% today, next year we'll be at 15, the year after at 10, the year after at 5, the year after 0. So we can reduce tariffs in an effective, balanced, scheduled way. And if people are clear about that, then they will ensure that they do the right kinds of things in their firms so that they can be competitive without tariffs in the long run. This helps domestic consumers because costs come down. But even more, as people point out, a tax on imports is also a tax on exports. In other words, the more we want to integrate with the world and sell to the world, the more competitive we will have to be, and we will only be competitive if we actually have lower tariffs on our imports. Because if we have high tariffs on imports, it ends up making our exports in the end less competitive. Take the garment industry again. They operate on really wafer intensive margins. Now, when you're making garments for export, yes, fine, you can import the fabric free of duty, right? But what about the thread? What about the buttons? What about the, collar lining material or whatever, right? You don't bother with all of those things and trying to get, those at duty free, on a duty free basis as well. Especially if you're buying it from a supplier just down the road. So you end up then paying more for all of those in between, those input items, which ends up making you less competitive in export markets. There's huge potential in export markets, even in the current geopolitically strained world that we live in now. Take the United States as the world's largest market, right? Whatever the United States does, I don't see a future where the United States is going to go back to making its own shirts and trousers and underwear and so on. Maybe they'll stop importing all of that from China, but they'll instead import from Vietnam, they'll instead import from Bangladesh, they'll instead import from Mexico, they'll import from Guatemala, say, right? why shouldn't they import from India? And they'd be perfectly happy doing so if we are competitive in those fields. So there's a big opportunity for us in these labor-intensive sectors and in more skill-based sectors as well, in export markets even now. We as a company, we're a medium-sized firm. We focus on emerging markets. We focus on Southeast Asia. We're very competitive in all of those markets in terms of what we sell. And we're not alone. There are many hundreds of firms like us, but there need to be thousands of firms like us that choose to invest in overseas markets to develop whatever it takes, whether it's branding, whether it's a local presence, whether it's local engineering, whether it's a local subsidiary, whatever it might take to build that kind of an international outlook. So while I buy the geopolitical stress that we're currently under, the disruption to supply chains that we're seeing in semiconductors and everything else, I think there's still a huge opportunity for world markets for us. Remember that India has about 1.6% of, we account for about 1.6% of total exports in the world. So it's a very small share. I think China's at, I don't know what the China's number is. I think it's around 15%, right? If you're at 15%, to grow to 20 is tough. To go from 1.5, 1.6% to 3% is much less tough. And that means that you double your exports. So it's a big opportunity, I think, that we have.
Right, and you've quoted the example of PPE manufacturers in India just after COVID and how they scaled up so dramatically, and masks.
Yes, very much so. I mean, we're the world's second largest supplier of PPE kits now, and we used to make zero 2 years ago. So that's a relatively low tech area, but it's a great area. Zero tariffs, by the way, and we're very competitive doing PPE kits to sell around the world.
Right, and I'm going to come to my last question, but and you talk, I mean, on the subject of trade, another interesting point that I noted in the book is how we import agarbattis from Vietnam, because they sent people and learnt the trade and went back, and who would have thought? Last question, Dr. Forbes. So, there is a problem here, and this book, for example, for instance, articulates that quite well. And when I say problem, I'm talking about the jobs, the lack of jobs, and the fact that we don't have enough quality of jobs, high quality jobs, and of course also the fact that many of those jobs, whether in low quality or otherwise, are really informal and therefore offer no security or longevity to those people who are in it. Are we cognizant of this problem as a country? I mean, do our actions today reflect a certain cognizance of this problem at a very broad policy level? And if not, what should we be doing?
So, we are cognizant of the problem. You might remember that it's one of the issues that tends to be raised, especially around election time. Government promised so many jobs, hasn't delivered on those promises, etc., etc. But unfortunately, those arguments tend to be almost entirely political. And we tend to base our jobs arguments in the absence of good quality data. And really, Govind, all credit to IndiaSpend, because the job that you do in IndiaSpend of putting good quality data out on every possible topic is just invaluable, because that's what we need in the country. We need a data-based approach to thinking about policy, and a data-based approach to debating vital issues of public policy. We can have a discussion and argument about, services jobs, manufacturing jobs. What's the best way of fostering the garment industry? Should we be fostering the garment industry? Wonderful to have all of that as a discussion, so that we can arrive at the right answers. And I'm not making any argument in my book that my answers are all right. I hope that they're convincing, but I'm not making the argument that they're the perfect answers, right? But I think these are the big questions that we need to ask ourselves, and these are the big questions that we need to debate. When you debate, if you have good data, it helps so much. And that's where, more power to you keep providing us with good data. And for employment, we have very poor data. The best data in the country doesn't come from the government. The best data in the country comes from CMIE, the center, a private institution from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, and they both provide the most accurate data and the most up-to-date data. The data every month. Where else? Even the government, when it talks about employment issues, very often will refer to CMI data. I think we can improve the quality of data that we have on employment really effectively. We should be able to say that what happened last month with employment. Countries around the world do this. Only CMI does it for India. I think that's fine. Let's get our employment data from CMI. Let's give them more resources, maybe even from the government, so that they produce even better quality data and make it publicly available so that everyone can fall over the same data and discuss these kinds of questions that are so vital to our future using good quality data, that at least people agree on the data. They may draw different conclusions of policy, but at least they're starting from the same point. Then hopefully they'll even end in the same place.
Right, and you, as you have in the books, is suggested that many of these data sourcing or gathering functions could be handed out to different organizations. You've talked about Pratham in the context of education, CMI in the context of employment, economy, and jobs.
Exactly. Yes, and steer in the cases of technology data, because I think that's the kind of country we are. That we're a country that has relatively low state capacity. We have the ability to formulate good policies. We struggle to deliver them on the ground, in terms of last mile delivery. The same applies to our data and our statistics. So I think to a large extent, we should limit our activity in the state to funding data production, to funding others doing it, and play a quality control role of ensuring that the data that's being put out is accurate and covers the areas that are important for the country to be covered.
Right. Dr. Forbes, we've run out of time completely. Thank you so much for joining me. The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential is the book that's now out, or has been out for some time. My recommendation to go ahead and read it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Govind. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thanks.